Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to Experiential Spirituality, Episode 8, Supernatural Beings. I go weekly at 1 p.m. GMT, and as ever you can ask me any questions you like through Curious Cat or in the chat or in the comments section below. While I wasn't doing these live streams on a weekly basis, which I am now doing permanently, I was sometimes answering questions on Twitter, which I don't really like doing, because the reason I like answering questions live is because then everyone gets to benefit from the answers, because I'm rarely asked a question that isn't asked many times, so it's good if I can give one response to benefit many. If I answer on Twitter, I don't use Twitter much, and my Twitter account is quite small, and not a lot of people see the answer. So from now on, whenever I receive a question, wherever I receive it, whether it's on YouTube or on Twitter or through Curious Cat, I'll be answering it in these episodes. Now, this week I got an interesting question. As ever, questions of a sensitive nature, things are kept strictly confidential. Sometimes I'm very glad when people don't give me certain details, and the soul that asked a certain question this week didn't give me details, which I appreciated, because sometimes souls give me details that put me in a rather awkward position. Now, as I said, everything is always in strict confidence, but I'd just rather not be put in that position. So, for example, a soul contacted me this week, and they've contacted me before about a certain issue, and again, we're going to keep this soul completely anonymous and everything is confidential, but they make reference to something they did wrong in the past but got away with, and the question essentially centres around what they should do about the guilt they feel for doing that in the present, or if it is even genuine guilt and if it's something they should act upon. And that's the kind of question I'm very glad when souls don't give me the details of. I don't want to know about some great crime you committed and got away with. I don't need to know the details of what you might have done. So I appreciate the fact that that soul didn't give me those details. But it was an interesting question, and I've already responded to that soul directly, but I want to speak on this issue broadly, because it can be challenging to discern what is something that is actually playing on your conscience and what is something you're just making a big deal of. It's a memory that lingers in your mind, but you're really making a far bigger deal of it than anyone else would, and you don't know whether you're just making a big deal out of nothing. I think this more comes naturally as you being able to discern between the two. It gets easier as you pay more heed to your conscience and your intuition, because as I've said before, your conscience and your intuition are nothing but the voice of God speaking through your shared spirit. Just as if you ignore your conscience consistently, you'll stop hearing from it, so too if you listen to your conscience and you obey your conscience, you'll become more sensitive to it, until you recognize that it's not something apart from you at all. It is the very thing that you are. It's your spirit. But while we remain disconnected from our unity with God, or unconscious of our unity with God, we experience our conscience and our intuition as if they're something separate speaking to us. So being able to discern between what are just silly things in the mind and what is a genuine issue in the conscience that needs to be dealt with, that just gets easier with time. Before that point comes, here's a general rule I would say on such matters. If you've done something wrong in the past and you don't know if you should confess to doing it in the present, I'll say on that issue what I said directly to the soul this week. It depends what it was. If the issue is that you once, for example, stole a bike and you got away with it, then I would just let it lie. If, on the other hand, the issue is that you murdered 3 people and buried their body somewhere, then yes, that is something you are certainly not going to be able to be at peace with until you turn yourself in for having done so. And see, this is why I'm very glad when souls don't give me details like that, because sometimes souls do give me those details, and again, it puts me in a bit of an awkward position. But the difference is, the important question is, when considering such things, is, are there other souls out there in this world right now suffering as a consequence of the fact that I'm not being honest about whatever it was I did in the past. That is the most important question. If you alone are being troubled by it, and if no one else would be concerned at all, then I would simply put it down to just something silly in the mind and not concern yourself with it. But if the suffering of other souls can be relieved by you confessing and turning yourself in for whatever it was that you did, then yes, that is clearly something you're going to have to do. And especially after years of whatever it was you did playing on your conscience, it's clearly not something that's going to go away anytime soon. And again, I don't want to know what it was in any case, but if it continues to play on your conscience, then clearly turning yourself in is something you will have to do. But again, for me, the deciding factor would be whether or not the suffering of other souls would be alleviated by you confessing to what you did. That would be the most important element for me. So that's the question I really wanted to respond to publicly this week, because I think it is an important issue. We've all done things wrong in the past. We've all done things that we regret, and there are things I've been very sorry for doing in my past. I mean, I've never committed any major crimes or anything like that, but I've been in relationships and I've hurt other souls on an emotional level unnecessarily. I've been racked with guilt for that. We've all been through those kinds of things, but there are those things that remain as memories in the mind, and at a certain point there were certain memories and certain things I used to feel guilty for. I used to have a guilty conscience over, that I just got frankly tired of being guilty over, because it's in the past. It was a minor thing in the first place, and eventually you just get done with that guilt and you realise that there's no point hanging on to it anymore. So as far as the soul that contacted me this week is concerned, is that the kind of thing they are dealing with? I really can't say, but I have experienced that as well as genuine remorse and those instances where I genuinely do need to make amends with another soul. Now this week I'm going to be speaking about ethereal beings. I've titled this episode Supernatural Beings because no one knows what ethereal beings refers to. Well, most people won't anyway. But aether is the term I chose to refer to that substance that others would call a ghostly substance, a phantom substance. And aether, as in A-E-T-H-E-R, is really an archaic form of the word ether, E-T-H-E-R. And I use the archaic form instead of the modern form because when you use the term ether, most souls, I think, would assume you're referring to the volatile substance, which I'm not. So I use the archaic term aether. And this was a term used by the ancient philosophers, it was used by medieval alchemists, and it was even used by some scientists in the 20th century. But I'm not going to confuse matters by going into the way they use the term aether, because it's not exactly how I use the term aether. Again, I use the term aether to refer to what others would call a ghostly, a phantom, or perhaps even an astral substance. I like the term astral. The problem with the term astral is that it's just astral. I say aether and ethereal. There's astral and then what? There's nothing comparable really. So I use ethereal. And just as we have a physical body, just as we have a mental body, aka our psychology, we also have an ethereal body, which is essentially our phantom or ghostly form. It is that which inhabits our mortal form and then leaves that mortal form. It is that which enables us to visit ethereal realms, whether they be heavenly or hellish. So I hope everyone is clear what I'm referring to. For me, language doesn't matter too much. The terminology I use doesn't matter too much. All that matters is that everyone understands what I'm referring to. And I think this is fairly straightforward. Ethereal equals ghostly or phantom. Simple as that, really. But aether shouldn't be confused with spirit, the spirit that we actually are, because spirit is non-phenomenal. It can never be perceived by any of the five senses. Now, aether typically can't be conceived by our five senses, but it can sometimes. If you think you see a ghost, if you genuinely see a ghost, you are witnessing an ethereal being. You are witnessing aether manifesting. So, aether can be perceived by the physical senses sometimes. Spirit, on the other hand, never can. The reason that the spirit that you are can never be perceived by the physical senses is because it is that as which you perceive everything. It is always that which perceives. If you are perceiving something, it is necessarily not you. You can perceive your own ethereal form just as you can perceive your own psychology, just as you can perceive your own physical body, and therefore you are necessarily not ultimately those things. Your physical body, your psychology, and your ethereal form, they are mere extensions of the spirit that you truly are. So it's important to be clear about that. Some may question why introduce this idea of aether at all. Are the categories of matter, mind, and spirit not enough? And the answer, quite simply, is no. And the reason is because it's on the level of our ethereal form that emotions are felt. When you only operate with the categories of matter, mind, and spirit, it's very hard to place the emotions, because they can certainly be provoked by the mind, but they're not felt within the mind, but they're not felt physically either. The reason is that they're felt on the level of our ethereal form. And so if you don't acknowledge the ethereal form, by whatever name you might call it, then you can't adequately place phenomenon like emotions. And this is very important. It's the reason why, if you're having some kind of out-of-body experience, if you have a near-death experience, if you have some kind of transcendent experience that involves you being outside of your mortal form, you can still feel emotions, which necessarily means that your emotions are not being generated within your mortal form, even if they are felt there in different ways. The reason is that they are being generated within your ethereal form. So it's on the level of aether that we feel emotions, and that's very important. Now, the problem with talking about this subject, supernatural beings, ethereal realms, whether they're heavenly or hellish, is that sometimes it risks distracting souls from what is more important. What's more important is your immediate experience of reality. So, of course, it is fun to speculate about ghosts and angels and demons. It's fun to speculate about those things, and there's nothing wrong with having fun speculating about them. I hope this particular episode will generate some entertainment in that regard. But what's always important is that we remain grounded in our present experience, because it's very easy for souls to imagine, to spend their days imagining, for example, all kinds of majestic ethereal realms, but meanwhile, in their day-to-day reality, their state of being is utterly miserable, and that just does no good at all. In such a case, a soul is essentially using these higher concepts as a form of escapism, which, there's nothing wrong with escapism unless it's being deferred to constantly. So it's always important that we remain focused on our present state of being in reality as it actually manifests. But the thing about aether is that you can't have a complete picture of reality without it, because there is so much phenomenon that you can't account for without it. Now, one thing I want to say is this is going to be, as soon as I say this, you'll realise the doors this opens. And because I'm going to do one of these every week, we've got plenty of time to elaborate and get into detail on all of these things. But, okay, first of all, hello everyone in the chat. Hello, Mr. Cool Mug, Tate, Greta, Agaratos, and Tate. Tate says, I've heard that phantom limb syndrome is related to the ethereal form. On that subject, I want to get into a bit more detail about the ethereal form. The story of Adam and Eve, and by the way, as you can tell, I'm speaking very matter-of-factly about these things, and the whole point of experiential spirituality is to verify through direct experience. So please be aware that I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm speaking matter-of-factly here and just asserting things. That's just the way I'm going to speak on this particular subject for now, because it's easier than me adding caveats to every sentence that I say. So, the Garden of Eden, that's a portrayal of heaven. It's a portrayal of the initial creation. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they were ethereal beings. They are ethereal forms. An example of this, or an example of how you can discern this from the text, is the fact this is something that comedians have picked up on a lot and they make fun of a lot. Atheists like to make fun of it, or rather philosophical materialists like to make fun of it, is that when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, the punishments that God gives to them don't seem to make sense. Because God condemns the man to have to work by the sweat of his brow, he condemns the woman to be subservient to the man and to endure pain during childbirth, and he condemns the serpent to slither along the ground and eat the dust of the earth for the rest of its days. And so philosophical materialists and comedians, they'll look at that and they'll say, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. That's stupid. These are stupid punishments because that is the lot of those beings by default. You know, a snake is going to slither along the ground and eat the dust of the earth by default. A woman is going to have pain in childbirth by default. But that assumes that Adam and Eve and the serpent were physical in the first place. It assumes that the Garden of Eden was a physical place here in the world, which it wasn't. It was the original ethereal realm created by God. Adam, Eve, and the serpent were ethereal beings. They were if you like, the heavenly archetype. The creatures of the Garden of Eden were the heavenly archetypes of the creatures that we see here in the world. The reason that God's punishment is what it is because those are the consequences of those ethereal beings being incarnated in mortal form. And the potentially controversial statement I want to say here is that while sex is an attribute of the material body, the physical body, gender is an attribute of Aether. That's why Adam and Eve were still acknowledged as male and female, or masculine and feminine, in the Garden of Eden. But they didn't endure those things that come about due to physical sex until they were incarnated. Now, the Garden of Eden is just an allegory. It's not meant to be taken as a literal depiction of anything, but it is an allegory concerning an ethereal realm, not an earthly realm. And so when you consider the fact that gender is an attribute of Aether in the same way that physical sex is an attribute of matter, well, you can imagine some scenarios that could come about, and maybe I'll go into more detail regarding them at some point in the future. And then when you add in the fact that the ethereal form of souls can be reincarnated again and again, not necessarily into physical bodies of the same sex, you can have a very complicated situation essentially. And I'm sure many of you are imagining the kind of issues this very much plays into. So as for ethereal beings, to return to direct experience, well, I've mentioned before the experience I had where my friend and I, we saw this phantom cat. Here in Great Britain there is a phenomenon called big cat sightings, where these big cats are alleged to be seen in places where they really shouldn't be. Now, up here in the Highlands of Scotland, in this county Caithness, the name Caithness, the name Kate comes from cat, and Ness refers to the fact that it's a headland. There was a Pictish tribe that once lived here, and they were known to the Norse as the Cat People, and that's why Caithness was in ancient times called the land of the Cat People. Now, we know that lynx used to live in these lands, but they were hunted to extinction at some point in ancient times, and it's almost certain that the Pictish tribe who lived up here, they venerated those lynx, and it's quite possible. I'm sure you've seen depictions of Roman soldiers, and they have, those animal heads as their helmets. It's quite possible that the Pictish tribe, or the Pictish people that lived up here, did similar things with the lynx, or they were their totem animal or something of that nature. But for me, that history is very significant to the fact that there are such sightings, even in the modern day, of these cats. Now, it's highly unlikely that such a creature could have survived into the modern day undetected, because when you think of the Highlands of Scotland, you might think of endless forests and things like that, but the area where I live, there's hardly any forest at all. It's mostly farmland. And so, some of you may have heard this story before, but I'll tell it again now. I used to have a friend that lived 5 miles outside of town on a farm, and what we would do is the rest of us would gather together and we would walk out along the country roads about 5 miles to that friend's house. We would stay there for a few hours, and then early in the morning, 2-3 o'clock in the morning, we would head back into town where the rest of us lived. On this particular occasion, I walked out with one other friend to my friend's farm. We stayed there for a few hours and we started to head back into town about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning as usual. Now it was pitch black at this time, but the moon was full, and it occurred to me when I lived down in the city, having being brought up here, but it occurred to me when I lived in the city that if someone's only lived in the city before, then they might have no idea what it's like out in the wilds at night. But it's dark. I mean, it's pitch black, but the moon can cast an amazingly generous amount of light. And when my friends and I returned to town from that farm, instead of following the country roads back into town, we would instead take a shortcut across the fields. And I say shortcut because it rarely was a shortcut, because we quite often got lost and ended up going on all kinds of random adventures on the way back to town. But regardless, on this particular night, my friend and I, we were heading across these fields, and we just climbed another fence, and because there's lots of barbed wire fences, and so we just climbed another fence, and about 5 feet in front of us, this massive cat just casually padded along in the darkness, and we both stood there, not moving, not saying anything for some time. And then we kind of looked at each other, just confirming, did you see that? So I have actually seen one of these so-called phantom cats, and of course history is filled with testimonies of phantom animals of various descriptions, very often dogs. Those accounts, I would say, are a form of ethereal being. Well, they're not an ethereal being in the sense that they're a lost soul. What I like to call them are ethereal echoes, in that they are echoes in time of animals that once lived in that particular area. So lynx once roamed these lands, and I would say that in certain conditions it's possible to see their echo. It's not that those lynx still exist as trapped souls, forever condemned to repeat the behaviours that they enacted thousands of years ago. It's that there's a kind of imprint on time, if you like. And so that's something you would call an ethereal being, but it's not some kind of trapped soul or anything of that nature. And that's one testimony I've had. Another testimony, of course, it's very rare to have these testimonies. Unfortunately, I don't have a big catalogue of such testimonies. But there's another incident that I've shared before, and that is very significant and leads me on to a particular point, which is that when I worked for that New Age fair, it was the biggest New Age fair in Scotland at the time, my bosses were a married couple, and they'd been married for a very long time, but one of them developed a brain tumour, and it was very sudden. The diagnosis was very sudden, and within 4 months he was dead. So it was a very, very sudden thing. But I went to visit him. This guy, this was a gay couple. They were a really nice couple, and again, they'd been together forever, but they were so nice to me and my girlfriend at the time, because I remember it just so happened that I had to go on a business trip down to Glasgow at the time, because I was in charge of managing this fair that was being held there, and they paid for my girlfriend to go with me, just so I wouldn't have to be alone down in Glasgow going about my business. And not only did they pay to put her up in a hotel, they actually gave us quite a lot of spending money. And these are my bosses. They were great bosses. But I went to see one of them, not long after his diagnosis with the brain tumor. And I was sitting in his living room, and he was telling me how a few nights earlier he'd sat and watched as ghosts, as phantoms, had come through the walls of his living room. Now that sounds like a terrifying experience, and I think that if most souls saw that, they would be terrified, but that's not how he was taking it. The way he was explaining it to me was that he was more fascinated than anything. He was just more fascinated that he'd seen these beings come through the walls, as terrifying as it sounds. And the last time I saw that man before he died, he was just lying there, and his physical body was still breathing, but you could tell the essence was gone. His mortal form was still ticking away, it was still functioning, but the essence was completely gone. And I always say, there's no doubt in my mind that when he left his mortal form, he found himself among those phantoms, for however long, only God knows. But that's an account of ethereal phenomenon that's not really all that unusual, not really all that uncommon. But the reason I raised that account in particular is because what a skeptic would say, of course, is that, well, you're talking about a human being who had a brain tumor. Therefore, we can't take anything he testifies of too seriously, because obviously the phenomenon that he produced was only produced because of the deterioration of his brain. This is where I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of reality, because what that perspective supposes is that there is a single reality, and only that which is agreed on by consensus can be regarded as real or serious, when I have almost the exact opposite effect. You see, I fully acknowledge that it was the deterioration of that man's brain that enabled him to see those phantoms, that enabled him to see those ghosts, but that doesn't mean that those phantoms were therefore unreal. No, they were absolutely real in the sense that they were perceived by that man. And even though he was the only soul to perceive them, that doesn't make them less real. So there's a very fundamental difference in how I see reality and how a more materialistically disposed individual would see reality. I don't agree with reality by consensus, and it's not that reality is wholly subjective. It's just the fact that if one person sees something, then that is real in the sense that it is being experienced. It's real to that soul, and therefore it is part of our collective reality in that sense. I don't immediately dismiss such accounts because the individual witnessing them was under certain conditions. Ultimately, as souls living in mortal form, or as souls full stop in fact, whether we're in mortal form or whether we're not, we are always experiencing endless permutations of reality. And the fact that that man had a brain tumour, that was just one more permutation of reality that he was experiencing. And because of that particular permutation, he was able to see things that most of us are not normally able to see. And it's really as simple as that. I don't at all dismiss his testimony of what he saw. The thing is that aside from the ethereal echoes that I mentioned earlier, those things that are just imprints on time, aside from those ethereal echoes, because they're not sentient beings, they're just echoes going through the same motions that the living creature did thousands of years or hundreds of years earlier. Every single thing, every single ethereal or supernatural being is a soul in a different state of being and in a different place. And I'm going to use angels and demons to give a perfect example of this, because an angel, quite simply, is nothing more than a soul that has attained salvation or enlightenment, or what I call rest. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were technically angels, but what's crucial is that you can be an angel in human form as well, because souls in human form can attain salvation, they can achieve enlightenment, or whatever term you want to use. Therefore, you can have angels in human form. And I often evoke different parts of the Bible to demonstrate this. But the Gnostics, of course, they believed in something called the divine twin. They believed that we all had an angelic twin. An angel is simply nothing other than the ethereal form of a soul that has achieved salvation or enlightenment. And so that soul could still be in mortal form as well, or they could be outside of mortal form, and when you see their ethereal form, it appears as very bright and glowing. And so, for example, you have that occurrence in the Bible where someone sees the Apostle Peter's angel, and it appears to be look just like him. Now, of course, as people love to point out, the word angel just means messenger, which is true, but that doesn't really explain the nature of the beings in question, which is what the issue is here. Crucially, in the book of Revelation, you have Yeshua delivering this message to the 7 churches, and then towards the end you have this angel appearing before John, and John falls down before the angel, and the angel warns him, no, don't worship me like that, because I'm just a servant just like you. And so angels are just souls that have reached salvation or enlightenment, whether they're in mortal form or outside of mortal form. When you see them outside of mortal form, you're naturally seeing their ethereal body, because they're no longer in their physical body. The most enlightening verse in the Bible on this issue for me is in the book of Hebrews, where the author says to always be kind to strangers just in case you're entertaining angels unawares. Now that could mean 2 things. It could mean what I just described, which is a soul that's still in mortal form that has attained salvation or enlightenment, and therefore they have an angelic status. Or it could be, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, it could be a reference to an angelic being that is not in mortal form but is roaming around in the guise of human form. I mean, that's possible. I don't think that's the case. I think it's referring to someone who has attained salvation while still in mortal form, but I'm just saying it could be the case. It's conceivable that the author of Hebrews was talking about an angel who was merely appearing as human and was not actually incarnated in mortal form. But, and this is where I want to take this right back down to experiential grounding, the kind of experiential grounding that my whole approach is about or centered around. Just as angels are the ethereal forms of those souls that have attained salvation or enlightenment or rest, whether they still exist in mortal form or whether they do not, so too are demons, those souls that go in. Demons are the ethereal forms of those souls that go in other directions. And I think a problem with these terms, angels and demons, is that when those terms are used, souls tend to think of very dramatic fictional portrayals when it's not quite like that. And there was a certain drama recently that has been very powerful in just reminding me the way that souls become demonic even while in mortal form, and the reason that they do, and it's very connected to the ethereal form. This episode might be highly confusing, I really don't know, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so I'm not going to name any names, but I'm sure many of you watching will be familiar with this drama. Let's just say, and you don't need to know the souls involved, but let's just say that there's a he's not on YouTube anymore because he's been banned from YouTube, but this individual, he still attracts a fairly big audience. Now, what happened just before Christmas is that another soul who had been watching his videos for a long time, this is a soul in female form, a woman. Maybe I'm becoming too complicated in the way I express things. But this woman, she enjoyed watching this guy's videos apparently, and what she did was that she travelled across the United States to go and visit this other individual in his home without his knowledge or without him knowing. And not knowing his exact address, what she did was that she, and by the way, this she recorded her journey and everything that happened afterwards in video logs, and that's how people know about this. What happened was that, knowing that this individual would go to the post office every so often to pick up his things, because sometimes his viewers sent him things through the post. Knowing this, she waited for him in the post office, and those of you who've seen her videos know that she is she's very unstable psychologically, and that's one of the reasons I don't want to use names, because I'm not going to start. I mean, she doesn't have the self-awareness for this kind of thing to really bother her, to be perfectly honest, but nonetheless, I'm not going to start doing that which could be humiliating, even though, again, she's far beyond being humiliated by anything, I think, quite honestly. But she's very clearly psychologically unstable. So she shows up in the post office and goes straight up to this guy and is like, because she believes she was sent on a divine mission. She believes she was psychically called to go and visit him. So she goes up to this guy in the post office and says, "Hey, I've been called psychically here to help you out. Or, I want to come and live with you and work on your farm with you." And of course, his reaction is, please don't do that. Please stay away from me, because he's got a wife and kids, and you don't want psychology. However much, and he said it himself actually. I don't like the guy, by the way. I think he's a moron, but he was right in what he said here. Is that he said he felt sympathy for her, and he would love for her to feel better, but his priority is to his wife and children. He's absolutely right about that. The reason I raised that story is because the things this woman has said in her videos, and just the way she's behaved, it's classic. It's the classic portrayal of how one becomes demonic, and you can see it play out. Sometimes she makes statements that just offer such a massive insight into how this happens. What happened, of course, after he rejected her in the post office, and she showed up in the post office twice, by the way, not one time but twice, and he rejected her both times. But what happened then, of course, is that her videos took a very different tone. In the beginning, she was talking about how she wants to go and live with him, and it's going to be great, and it's going to be this ideal Walton Little House on the Prairie style scenario. Yeah, we used to get those programs over here. I used to love them as a kid. But after he rejected her, Tate says, literally going postal. I'm ashamed I never thought of that. After he rejected her, of course, the videos took a very different turn. Suddenly, he's the Antichrist. Suddenly, he's everything bad. He's everything wrong. He's a deceiver. He's a betrayer, and so forth. And what I'm watching those videos, I've been through this so many times. I think all of us have to some degree, just not to that extreme a degree. I think some of us, or maybe even most of us, might have been guilty of it at one time or another. And it's most commonly experienced in the context of relationships. So, here's what happens. And you'll see this anywhere on social media, is that, and this is why it pertains to the ethereal form, because again, it's on the level of the ethereal form that we feel emotions. The thing is that there are lots of souls out there whose worldview is informed not by a mental assessment of reality, but the way they feel on the level of their ethereal form. So let's take a very common example of one soul who becomes romantically attracted to another soul. On the level of their ethereal form, they feel a certain way towards this other soul, and that begins to inform their their system of belief, if you like. So they feel a certain way towards this other soul on the level of their ethereal form, and that then informs their mind, and certain intellectual constructs start developing. And before you know it, this soul is imagining this romantic future with this girl or with this boy or whatever the situation might be, and they've essentially created a fantasy for themselves that is informed by how they feel. They feel a certain way, and therefore their perception of reality rearranges to match that feeling, as opposed to the other way around, where you see reality how it is, you assess reality calmly, and go from there. That's not how many souls operate. And again, I think most of us have been guilty of this, especially when we were younger and we were infatuated with someone of the opposite sex or the same sex or whatever it might be. But of course, what happens in such scenarios typically is that the boy or the girl, maybe they'll approach the soul they're romantically interested in, and if they get rejected, then they feel a great amount of suffering on the level of their ethereal form. It's emotional suffering. Most of us have been through that, and most will get over that. But in extreme cases, the attachment just grows worse. And I've been through this before with certain souls, and it's one of the most horrible things to experience that's quite common, that's quite casual. And that's exactly what you're seeing with this woman, is that again she's quite mentally unstable. But she felt a certain way about this guy and what he was presenting through his videos, and the life he lived out there on his farm, and with his wife and his kids. She felt a certain way about that on the level of her ethereal form, and especially in her case, because she was mentally unstable anyway, the way she feels begins to inform the way she perceives the world, instead of the other way around. And you see this again all over social media, just to less extreme degrees, where souls are not seeing the world as it is, but rather they're seeing it either as they feel it is, or as they feel it should be, one of those two. And so this woman has this powerful emotional resonance with this individual, and her perception of reality just shifts to conform to that feeling. And so she fully expects, when she travels to this guy's farm, that he's just going to accept this complete stranger and say, hey, yeah, just move in with me and be with my wife and kids, even though you're a complete stranger, which is completely unrealistic expectation. But because she feels a certain way on the level of her ethereal form, she fully expects that to happen. And she said it herself after being rejected. She said, I really expected him to let me come and help him on his farm, but it didn't happen, of course. But the really ugly bit comes after that rejection, when a soul doesn't let it go, when a soul just becomes all the more attached and all the more obsessive, because the way they perceive, this is what's so crucial, this is so essential to understand, this is so important to understand. You can look at another soul's behavior and say, it doesn't make sense. The way they're explaining their view of reality makes no sense, because it's inconsistent. 1 minute they're saying this, and 1 minute they're saying this. And you'll never make sense of that for as long as you assume that what's involved is a purely intellectual process. Because if you assume that what's involved is a purely intellectual process, then you're trying to connect intellectual dots, essentially. And you can't connect intellectual dots if their way of seeing the world is not in fact informed solely by rational thought. And in the case of most souls, it is not. It's emotional. So, for example, this woman, she goes from loving this individual to the extent that she gave everything up to go and move in with him, to despising him and essentially presenting him as the Antichrist. Now that makes no sense at all. How is it 1 minute you're saying this soul is the best thing ever, and then the next minute you're saying this soul is the Antichrist? On a logical basis, that makes no sense, because what she said before completely contradicts what she is now saying. But of course it makes all the sense in the world if you take into account what's going on the ethereal level, on the emotional level, because this soul rejected her. That sends vibrations through her ethereal form causes emotional turmoil. That emotional turmoil informs the way she perceives reality, and suddenly this guy goes from being a great savior to being a manipulator, a deceiver, and so forth. Again, it's got nothing to do with rational thought, it's just the emotion she feels on an ethereal level informing her perspective of reality. And that's why you can never reason with these with souls like that. It's because they're not operating on reason. Their perspective of reality is being informed almost solely, almost entirely, by how they feel about things. And you have no way of anticipating how they're going to feel about any given thing, and therefore you have no way of anticipating how they are going to perceive reality next. But if you listen to this woman speak about this individual after the rejection, it's hard. I mean, I can think of other examples, but it's one of the best examples of someone speaking in a truly demonic fashion. She is just being, I know this sounds quite weak, but she is just being horrible. I mean, she really is. Again, he's gone from someone who in her eyes was a great savior to someone who is now like the Antichrist. And it's just because he rejected her, and there's no point trying to approach her with logic as others have done, because some souls have said to her, wait a minute, you're saying now he's a con artist, he's this and that, then why were you willing to travel across the United States to go and live with this con artist? There's no point approaching her with that kind of rationale and logic, because she's not operating on that level at all. But it's the entitlement, it's the narcissism, it's the expectation at every level. The idea that this guy, for example, one thing she said was that, well, this guy in his videos, he says that when someone is in need, especially when they're an older person, you should take care of them. But look, when I showed up in his town, he didn't take care of me. Now, that is abusive to me. That's like if you know that a certain organisation in your town is giving away free food to the homeless, so you make yourself homeless just to get free food. That is abusing someone's desire to do good. And again, I don't like this guy at all. I have nothing good to say about him, quite honestly. I think he's one of the worst. But in this case, no, he's the victim of someone who's, I honestly think, is a complete narcissist. And again, this is not the kind of soul I'm completely unfamiliar with myself, unfortunately. And that's why seeing her behaviour, it really reminded me of certain things and made me want to talk about it in this show, because it's really repugnant, and I've seen it so many times before, and it really is demonic behaviour. And the point is, going back to angels and demons being the ethereal forms of souls in different states of being. If your mortal form is destroyed while you have achieved angelic status, as it were, while you have attained salvation or enlightenment, then you become an angel in the sense that your ethereal form is free and you go to a heavenly realm. But if you die, if your mortal form dies while you're in some kind of demonic state, then you will go to a hellish realm, an ethereal hellish realm, where you will be, for all intents and purposes, a demon. This woman, and I hate to say this, but you can't not see it if you listen to her speak. She is at that level. Even the way she projects her voice, it's quite chilling. You know, if you imagined how a demon would speak, even if you're imagining some cartoon form of demon from medieval literature, it would speak in that way. Not just in terms of the things that she's saying, but in the way she's saying it. It's just the self-pity as well. That's another thing, and I have experienced this with certain narcissistic souls myself, is that whereas formerly they they presented themselves as really strong, able to endure anything. And in some cases, they present themselves as someone who will benefit you in some way. They present themselves as someone who can bring something positive to your life. But as soon as, and here's what causes the problem. Here's what really gets them going on an emotional level. Here's what it is. It's when you set boundaries. The moment you set boundaries, that's what sets them off. And then you are the Antichrist to them. So whereas before, they were talking about how they can provide something in your life and how they're going to benefit, your life is going to flourish just by their mere presence. Suddenly, when you set boundaries and you reject them in some form, suddenly they start playing the victim. Suddenly they'll start talking about how they've got all these psychological ailments, how they've got this problem, how they've got that problem, and now you're being abusive because you're picking on someone who really can't defend themselves. So that's one thing they almost always do. They go from presenting themselves as a very strong and empowered soul, which they're very clearly not, to then suddenly they're playing the victim. And what's funny as well, and this happens in relationships all the time, by the way, I see some people in chat know exactly the situation I'm referring to. Another thing is that when they start feeling negatively towards you, after you've established boundaries, when they start feeling negatively towards you, and I've had this experience myself, and again, this is why watching this situation unfold has just made me go, oh no, I've been through this before, this is not good. The moment you establish boundaries, suddenly they are weaponizing things against you that they apparently didn't mind before. Like, they're suddenly throwing things in your face that they've known about for a long time and they've never mentioned before. And again, this happens quite often, when two souls in a relationship break up. And for me at least, it's not something that you can come back from. Because let's say I'm in a relationship with a girl and we have some argument and she starts throwing things in my face that have been present in our life for a long time. Things that I do, habits that I have, or what have you, or something that I said. She starts reminding me of these things and she presents them as wrongs that I've done, but she's never mentioned them before. So the reason for me our relationship is dead at that point is that I'm always thinking, okay, if you've remained silent about those things for this long and only now are you telling me that you have a problem with them, and what I thought you were fine with, or what I thought you were even happy with, you're telling me now is something that you despise and is a problem of mine, and it's a weakness of mine, and it's why I'm a bad person. If you're saying this now, then moving on into the future, how do I know that you're not silently stewing on things that I'm doing now? How do I know that a year down the line, you're not going to be throwing things in my face that I took to be perfectly innocent at the time? And that's why, for me, a relationship is just over when someone does that, because you can never trust them from that point forth. And honestly, if you have a soul in your circle that is very clearly that kind of emotional vampire, as it were, someone who seems to thrive on provoking an emotional reaction from you, because they do this as well, because again, they're so centered around their emotional state of being that they try to provoke your emotions so they can get some kind of twisted satisfaction or sustenance from doing so. I would, and it's not often I would say this about any soul, but I would strongly recommend that you just distance yourself from them, because, and I say this because I've made the mistake of giving such souls the benefit of the doubt in the past before. You will come to bitterly regret letting such souls get close to you, and there will come a point where they'll behave in such a demonic fashion that you will deeply regret ever having overlook their former behavior, overlook the warning signs. So that's how, we all know how a soul becomes angelic. They become angelic by surrendering their egoic will to the will of God and obeying the voice of their conscience, because the conscience is the voice of God speaking through a shared spirit, and no soul can go wrong by obeying their conscience, and God will lead them right. So we all know how souls become angelic, how our ethereal forms become angelic, but it's not so easy to say how a soul becomes demonic, because again, when I use, or when anyone uses terms like angel and demon, quite often these really these dramatic fictional portrayals are evoked within the mind, when really evil is actually quite mediocre, but it's still easily recognizable, and that is just one way how one becomes demonic. They become like an emotional leech on another soul, and they can go from loving, or supposedly, not really of course, but supposedly loving that soul to hating that soul, just based on to whatever degree that soul is prepared to tolerate them. And that's why it's when you set boundaries that those souls will go from seeing you as an angel to seeing you as a demon, or seeing you as someone great to seeing you as someone malevolent. And so it's been so insightful watching this unfold, because it's something I've seen in my own life to lesser and greater degrees, and it just offers such a great insight on how people become demonic. Because the woman in question here, she's quite old, and if she keeps living the way she's living, she's honestly not going to have long left to live in her mortal form. And that's the kind of soul, I'm not very evangelistic in the way I put things forth, because I think that souls have to find their own way. But that's the kind of soul where, if you were in a position to minister to her, if you were in a position to try and bring her back onto the path of God, as it were, you'd want to do so with great urgency, because she can't possibly have long left, based on her age, based on her physical health, based on her psychology, and based on the way she's living, because having surrendered everything to go across the United States to live with this guy, and not being able to live with this guy, she is now officially homeless and living in her car. So this is a situation that is still ongoing. I can't see it ending in a positive way, but I just wanted to use it as an illustration of how one can become demonic in some very mundane ways. You have an emotional attachment to someone, and it just goes from there. What I don't like is entitlement, and that's what's really off-putting, and what's quite disgusting about some of the things that she said is that she fully believes, and again, I don't like this guy at all, I don't like him at all, but this woman fully believes that she is entitled to his time. She is entitled to his attention. She is entitled to this, she is entitled to that. No soul owes any other soul anything. And what's really insidious is that she's done something else that I've seen souls in this state of being do before, which is very insidious. She sent him something that was precious to her. It was a book and a photograph. So she sent this to his P.O. box. And, when he went down to the post office to pick up his post, he happened to pick that up as well. So he has this in his possession now, through no fault of his own. He was sent this, it was addressed to him, he picked it up, and now he has it in his home. And so, of course, what she's done now is that she's weaponized that against him, because now she's been saying, well, you have this book that I gave you, you have this very valuable, precious picture, and I want those things back, because she knows that the only way, since she lives in her car, the only way that he can possibly give that back to her is to give her the very audience that she wants. So it's hard to tell, because it's hard to imagine this woman being clever enough to think of that. But Neurocraft did it again. Neurocraft never misses. Episode 8, Defense Against Borderline Personality Disorder. It's hard to imagine this woman thinking so clearly as to plan that out, but I have known souls that have planned that kind of strategy to essentially ensnare another soul into having to deal with them. And it's so devious. Again, it's so demonic. Sometimes people use demonic in a very cheap way, but it really is demonic, just ensnaring someone like that. So now this guy, who again I don't like at all, but now he's in a position where he owns this thing that is precious to this woman, and he has to hear this woman say, "Oh, I want that back. It's very precious to me," but he didn't ask for it. And this is another thing. No soul owes you anything, and that is true no matter how generous you are to them. You can't buy someone's devotion. Like, let's say that I accepted money in some way through this live stream, and let's say that someone out of nowhere gave me £1,000. Obviously, I would receive that generously, and I'd be, oh wow, that's really generous. And my first thought would be, I hope you can afford this. But I would receive it generously, of course. But then, if they came back a month later and said, hey, I gave you £1,000 last month, so now you have to come out and have lunch with me, I'd be like, no, you gave me, I didn't ask for money, you gave me that money of your own free will, I don't now owe you anything because you freely chose to give me that money, but that's how some souls do, because it's very insidious, it's very manipulative, but I think I've made my point, and that is just one of the many subtle ways that one becomes truly demonic. See, I'm not worried about disembodied ethereal souls as demons, because ethereal forms, they can't hurt you. If you see a horrific ethereal form, some kind of ghost or phantom, it might terrify you, but it can't hurt you. It can only hurt your own idea of yourself. It's psychological assault more than it's anything. But while we exist in mortal form, the thing to worry about, if there is anything to worry about, which there really isn't, but the greatest threat, at least to our mortal form, is not demons that are disembodied in the ethereal realm, it's demons that live in mortal form among us, of which there are many. That's the real thing, that's the real threat if you want to remain alive in mortal form. So I thought this was an important topic to cover. I'm going to turn to the chat now. You will recognise them by their fruit, says Liam. Yes, it's so simple. And in every area of spirituality, it really is as simple as you will recognise them by your fruit. It's so strange to me how you have souls behaving in certain ways. Souls who, for example, will go on live streams and they'll swear and they'll curse. They'll wish death on this person, wish death on that person. And then there'll still be people discussing, does this person speak on behalf of God? It's like, well, no, obviously not. It shouldn't even be a question. Agarato says, pro tip, when faced with a psycho/sociopath, get away/run. No contact ever again. Yes, you're absolutely right. And just saw that comment, Tate. Yes, you're absolutely right. I said it earlier. This is the problem, is that I've made this mistake before myself, is that I've entertained such souls because in many cases I felt sorry for them, or I wanted to know if they were doing okay. And so because I felt sorry for them, or because I believed something they said, I let them back into my life, and I have never had anything but regret from doing so. And it's because, as even this guy who I don't like said, you want to help other souls. You want them to be okay. You want them to be happy. But the honest truth is that I've never met a soul in such a wretched state of being that wasn't fully responsible for putting themselves there. All of them have a million sad stories. All of them have a million sad stories, and and here's a real red flag, here's a real tell. Almost all of them will tell you about how just about every relationship they've been in has involved someone with narcissism, has involved someone being abusive towards them. Now, when someone tells you that every relationship they've been involved in has involved a narcissist or an abuser, it's almost a guarantee that they themselves are the narcissist, that they themselves are the abuser, because they are the variable there, right? And it's almost a certainty that that very same soul is one day going to be telling someone else about how you're a narcissist or about how you're an abuser, even if you were nothing but nice to them. So yes, absolutely right. Stay away. Tate quotes Alexander Pope, "For fools rush in where angels fear to tread." A Faustian spirit. I live about 20 miles away from him too. Well, you could have eyes on him too then. That's what she was saying in her videos. Well, she said a lot of things that could easily be taken to be threats as well. You're going to feel my wrath. You've got eyes on you. Now everyone's going to know what you're doing. And when it was suggested to her that the individual in question might actually shoot her if she shows up at his home, she said, "I want to die. You know, I would love it if he showed up and shot me," which isn't good. Nicholas Holmes says, "I'll be honest, I think this particular internet drama has completely passed me by. I have no idea who these people are," which is possibly a good thing. It might be a good thing, but it is interesting, I've got to admit. Faustian Spirit said, "The people with power around here are aware of him and his grift, and he's trying to carpetbag our governments now too, and it's going to blow up in his face. It's the ex-coke head race mixing sex addict Mamzer that used to work with Crowder." Oh, he was responding to someone else. Oh, he did used to work with Crowder, didn't he? I forgot about that. "She's got serious mental and spiritual problems too. Like attracts like, as it were." Big Bear. Okay, there's a certain theme emerging here, which I agree with, because Where's the Hidden Hand says, "Big Bear attracts some broken people. I wonder why." And likewise, Faustian Spirit says he invited that behaviour through his own input, though. Yes, I completely agree with both of those sentiments. This is why I don't like the guy. I don't understand his fan base, because I listen to the guy talk, and first of all, he keeps saying he has a high IQ. He seems really low IQ to me. That's just the way it is. He's very crude in the things that he says, and I just don't get the appeal. I mean, I might be able to understand how someone could watch him for entertainment, you know, because he does ridiculous things, but I don't understand how anyone sees him as someone who is wise. I don't get that at all, so I don't know what I'm missing there, but I've never liked the guy. Tate says, "I'm waiting for David's OnlyFans account before donating." Where's the Hidden Hand? Vox got Big Bear onto that sweet Christian dollar. Is that what happened? I haven't known them known of them for that long to know the history of how it's developed. Greta says it's a form of stalking, and people have lost their lives that way. He was right not to accept that behaviour. Yes, you can't just impose yourself on another soul. The only thing that surprised me about the situation was how, I hate to say this, but how generous he was about it. Because when it first happened, I expected that he would go absolutely mental. I thought he would go, because, you know, he's quite on edge anyway. You know, I thought it would drive him into a deeper kind of psychosis, and so you'd have these two mentally unstable people clashing with each other. But surprisingly, that didn't happen. Instead, he makes a video again saying, you know, "I wish this woman felt better. You know, I know how desperate she is. I wish I could have helped her, but my priority is to my wife and my children." That's what surprised me. I did not expect such a good, frankly, a positive reaction from him. He actually impressed me there. Nicholas Holmes says, "A former friend once gave me a copy of Dawn of War as a gift. About a year or so later, he demanded I give him it back, as it was actually still his. He didn't get it back. Greta says, fair enough, I don't know the characters or who they are. Faustian Spirit says, perhaps people or souls like this are spiritual composters. I often wonder if they destroy themselves and others for a greater purpose they do not understand. That's a great question. That goes into the issue of free will. And, of course, it's not an issue I should probably start elaborating upon an hour and 15 minutes in. But that for me would very much play into free will. Because the question is then, are they... I mean, I have definite opinions on this. And here's another form of this phenomenon that I get often. You know, I love interacting with souls, right? I love hearing their opinions and answering their questions. But every so often, I'll get like a message somewhere, and it will be someone instructing me what to say, like telling me what I should say in my next live stream. That's another manifestation of the same phenomenon. This expectation that I'm going to suddenly start being a puppet for someone else. Why would I do that? I very clearly have my own opinions on things, and I don't care who disagrees with me, but I very clearly have my own opinions. And so what happens is that they'll send me this list of demands, things that I have to say in my next live stream, which of course I don't do. I don't even acknowledge such messages, which is rare because I respond to absolutely everyone. But when someone just tries to impose themselves like that on me, I don't respond at all. And then invariably a few days later, when I don't do what they say, I'll get a very, very angry message talking about how I've dismissed their wisdom, or how I've got a lot to learn because I didn't heed what they had to tell me. I'll never understand the mentality of a soul who imposes themselves on another like that. But this does play into the issue of free will, because yes, you know, if you suppose, well, again, Faustian Spirit said, I often wonder if they destroy themselves and others for a greater purpose they do not understand. So the question would then be, are they being compelled to do that against their will? And if that is the case, then can they be held morally accountable for it? You know what? I'm going to leave that as a great seg, and I've decided that next week I'm going to cover the issue of free will. So thank you very much for watching, everyone. Again, this show goes out live every Sunday at 1 p.m. GMT. The time zones change here sometimes, but it's always 1 p.m. GMT. If you've got any questions, then you can feel free to ask them in chat or in the YouTube comments section below, through email, or anonymously through Curious Cat or through Twitter or anything else. All these links are in the description box below. Thank you very much for watching, everyone, and may your moment be mystical.